For years, gamers have cried out for a true successor to the PS Vita, a PlayStation cult favourite handheld device, but instead they got the PS Portal, a remote play device that is entirely dependent on both the internet and a PS5. This has proven to be a rather controversial release for a lot of people, with many confused as to why Sony is taking this half measure when there seems to be such a clamouring for a PS Vita 2. But here's the thing, I don't think Sony's ever going to make the Vita 2, and I think that's actually the smart decision. First, a little history. The PlayStation Vita launched across the world between 2011 and 2012, the dying years of the PS3 generation. It followed on from the PSP and was accompanied in the handheld space by the Nintendo 3DS. Some of its catalogue included games like Hotline Miami, Resogun, and Uncharted Golden Abyss, the latter of which was developed exclusively for the Vita. The Vita was admittedly ahead of its time with a compact yet comfortable form factor and an OLED screen, a feature that wouldn't become more common for a decade. Yet despite this, the Vita undersold and underperformed, and as fewer people bought the device, more developers lost interest and incentive to support it. Releases for the device petered out across the PS4 generation, and by the end of 2021, 10 years after its initial release, the final physical games for the Vita were released, and developers could no longer submit their games to be sold through the Vita store. That brings us to the PS5 generation. Despite the Vita being a commercial failure, it had accumulated a cult following over the years, and many began to suspect that Sony would finally make its return to the handheld market. With the successes of devices like the Nintendo Switch and the Steam Deck, handheld gaming seemed bigger than ever. Rumours began to circulate about a Project Q handheld device from Sony, which proved to be true when the PS Portal was revealed in August of 2023. Already we've seen quite the response to the Portal. Now, I personally have really enjoyed my time with it, and the general consensus is that it's a solid solution to a niche problem. However, many were disappointed that it wasn't the PS Vita 2 that they'd hoped for, but I strongly believe that a PS Vita 2 has no place in the modern gaming landscape. So let's consider Sony's business model for the PS5. Every gaming peripheral or accessory that Sony currently releases has the primary purpose of boosting sales of the PS5. From VR headsets to console cover plates, everything acts as a big or small reason for players to choose PlayStation over other platforms. I think of it as a similar thing to the Apple ecosystem. The PS5's ecosystem is there to improve and expand the experience of its players, but ultimately is there to keep players playing. Once they've bought their way in, there's more reason to stay. That sales philosophy is really difficult to bake into a dedicated handheld device, and for a couple of reasons. If Sony was to develop a theoretical Vita 2, it could go down one of two routes. One, a handheld device that can natively play PS5 games, or two, a handheld device with its own set of games like the original Vita. The first, of course, is entirely at ends with the sales philosophy, and would essentially give players a reason not to buy the PS5. Additionally, that starts to percolate its way into the development of games, because PS5 titles need to run on the PS5 and the Vita 2. It's an issue that we've faced with the cross-gen period of PS4 and 5 games that is steadily phasing itself out. Then to consider the second option, handheld gaming isn't quite what it used to be. While there is a niche market for older styled smaller games, many casual gamers expect large-scale titles like Tears of the Kingdom on the Switch, or some of PlayStation's very own like Spider-Man on the Steam Deck. The gap between console and handheld has closed rapidly since the days of the Vita. With that level of expectation, Sony would need to invest a significant amount of money into a device that essentially creates its own sub-market, with its own version of AAA development, and all aside from the PS5. Would it pay off? History suggests not. And it's also worth considering whether Sony has the bandwidth to develop big PS5 games like Spider-Man 2 alongside big PS Vita 2 games. Now you may be thinking, but Nintendo does it successfully, the Steam Deck has been a success. And yes, they have, but those are two very different products with very different circumstances. Nintendo, for example, a company that used to have a handheld and a console, decided to combine both of those markets into a hybrid console handheld. It meant that it could pull and focus its resources on a single outlet rather than potentially spread itself thin by continually developing two different libraries of content. The Steam Deck and other PC-based handhelds like the ROG Ally aren't really pulling from another product, but exist in their own bubbles, since PCs are sold independently rather than by a singular company like Sony. Now that is why the PS Portal is really the ideal solution for Sony. It introduces a handheld device that can play its PS5 games, but doesn't detract from the overall sales of the PS5, doesn't require additional development, and doesn't hold back the quality of the PS5 games themselves. While it may not be the PS Vita 2 that everyone had hoped for, it really is the smartest answer to Sony's handheld conundrum. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the very end. I want to make it clear that I'm not saying I wouldn't like a PS Vita 2 myself, I just don't think it makes sense anymore in the current gaming climate. But let me know whether you think a PS Vita 2 would be a success for Sony down in the comments. And remember, if you want to see more PlayStation video content like this, then hit that subscribe button. Anyway, until next time, I've been Aaron, and this has been Push Square.